The morning the lawyers came to Cravenhurst Hall, the old Duchess put on her gloves before she came downstairs, and Bryony Galmoy, who had been 3 months in the house, and noticed everything because noticing was the only currency a music mistress was permitted, saw that the left glove sat oddly at the heel of the hand. There was a hardness there, a small ridge of iron under the kidskin, and the Duchess kept that hand closed in her lap through the whole of the interview, and never once opened it, not even to take the cup of chocolate Mrs. Straya Dunwell brought her, which she lifted instead. With her right, Bryony was supposed to be at the pianoforte. She was supposed to be filling the cold drawing-room with something gentle and forgettable while the gentlemen talked. Because a house of grief is permitted music the way it is permitted a fire, to keep the worst of the chill from settling. So she played, and she watched the closed glove hand, and she listened to the man in the dark coat say the word entail, and the word claimant, and the name Vandré, and she understood without being told anything that the old woman across the room was frightened, and that the old woman was determined not to be seen frightened, and that the key in her glove was the reason for both. It was the 3rd week of October, and the Duke had been 4 months in the churchyard at Loxhill, and the season had ended for everyone who had a season to end. The leaves had gone from the great avenue of limes, the fountains were dry. Half the rooms wore holland covers like a household already, half asleep, and into this hush had come the lawyers and the cousin, and the question that all of England's law existed to answer, which was simply who would have the place now, and what would happen to everyone in it who could not pay to stay. He said her name later, in the corridor, when she did not expect it. The Earl of Esterly, who was the late Duke's nephew, and the only Hartnell the law trusted with anything, stopped her at the foot of the back stair with a single word, and the word was not her name at all but a question. He asked whether she had been long in the house. She said, 3 months. My lord. He looked at her hands, which still held the sheet of music she had not been allowed to finish, and he said nothing for a moment that lasted too long to be nothing. And then he said that the Duchess was fond of music, and that she should keep playing, whatever happened, because the playing did the old woman good. Then he was gone up the stair 2 at a time, and Bryony stood with her heart going harder than the climb could account for, and told herself it was the cold. To Cravenhurst she was just the music mistress. The room had decided that before she arrived. A dowerless gentlewoman of 24 with a dead father, a small competence that had died with him, and an education too fine for service and too poor for marriage. She was the sort of woman a great house engaged, the way it engaged a piano tuner, useful, invisible, and not quite real. She had taught the squire's daughters at Hollowmere their scales. She had copied music for a circulating library in the town. When the Duchess of Cravenhurst, who had buried her husband and could not bear the silence of the long gallery, sent word that she wanted a young woman who could play and who could hold her tongue, Bryony had come and had been grateful, and had not asked why a house in mourning wanted a stranger more than it wanted peace. She found out by degrees the way one finds out the true shape of a dark room by walking into the edges of it. The first edge was the glove. The Duchess wore gloves indoors, which was not so strange in a cold house, except that she wore them at the pianoforte, where Bryony could see that the left hand never bent quite naturally, as though it cradled something it could not set down. The second edge was the stable. The great stable block beyond the kitchen garden stood empty. The carriage horses sold, the hunters gone with the Duke, the doors chained, and yet a thread of smoke rose from its end chimney some mornings, thin and quickly gone, and no one in the house would say why. And Mrs. Patter Dunwell, when Bryony asked, said only that the chimneys drew foul in autumn, and that a curious woman was a tiresome one. The third edge was the food. Mrs. Dunwell carried a covered basket out across the kitchen garden each evening at dusk, and came back with it empty. And this Bryony saw from the music-room window without meaning to, the way one sees the moon. She did not ask again. She had learned what a roof was worth, and how easily a question could cost a woman hers. There were small kindnesses in the house that kept her. Beneath the cold of it, Mrs. Dunwell, who had been 40 years at Cravenhurst and had a face like a closed cupboard, took to leaving a second candle by Bryony's place at supper without a word. which was the housekeeper's way of saying that a young woman who worked late by her own choice should not work in the dark. The old butler, Ferrand, a stooped man who moved through the covered rooms like a memory of himself, once stopped her on the back stair to tell her that the late Duke had loved a particular slow air, and hummed 3 notes of it so quavering and untuned that she could not have named the tune from them. And yet she found it that afternoon among the Duke's sheets and learned it for him, and played it the next evening, and saw the old man stand a long while in the doorway with his eyes shut. These were the threads by which a stranger is sewn into a house, and Briony felt herself being sewn, and was glad of it, and tried not to think how easily the thread could be cut. The cousin came to dine the 2nd week, and that was when she first heard him called by his whole name, Mr. Vondré, and saw the way the Duchess held her closed hand under the table the entire meal. He was a smooth man of 50, with soft white hands and a voice that never rose, and he spoke to the Duchess with a tenderness so complete that it took Briony half the dinner to understand it was a weapon. He grieved with her. He worried for her. He wondered aloud gently whether the burden of so great a house was not too heavy for a lady of her years, alone, with no one near of her own blood, and whether she might not be happier in the dower house at Marwick, somewhere small and warm and easy to manage. He said that last, with his eyes on her gloved hand. Briony saw it. The Duchess saw that she saw it, and the old woman's chin came up the smallest fraction, the way a fighter lifts the head before the bell, and she said, in a voice as smooth as his own, that she found she carried very little these days, and that the dower house was damp, and that she would trouble dear cousin Vondré no further on the subject of her comfort. Lady Galindra Corwood was there too, seated at Vondré's right, a beautiful woman of 29 whose family had been promised something in this house long ago and meant to collect it. She was the kind of beauty a season produces, and then forgets, polished, certain. With a low, pleasant laugh, she used the way other people used a fan. She had decided that the Earl of Esterley would marry her, and she had decided it some years before, on the reasonable ground that everyone agreed she was the correct choice. And she watched Leander Hartnell down the length of the table with the patience of a woman who has never once been refused anything she was told she could have. When her glance crossed Briony at the pianoforte, it passed over her without weight, the way a glance passes over furniture. A music mistress was not a rival. A music mistress was not anything at all. What Briony did not yet know was that Vondré had not come for the dower house, and that the smooth voice and the soft hands had already set in motion a thing that would, before the month was out, put a man's neck in danger and a great estate into the keeping of a forger. That night she could not sleep, and she went down to the music room because the playing did her good as much as the Duchess, and she found the old woman there before her, in the dark, in her wrapper, with the gloves off. And for the first time Briony saw the left hand bare, and saw the key it had been guarding. A small black stable key on a worn ribbon, looped twice round the wrist and tucked into the palm. And she saw the Duchess press it to her mouth the way a woman presses a letter she cannot bear to send. The Duchess did not start. She was too old and too tired to start. She only looked at Briony for a long moment in the moonlight, and then she said, very quietly, that she supposed a girl who could hear a wrong note across a room could hear a wrong house too, and that she had wondered how long it would take. Then she told her, not all of it. Not that night, but the shape of it, and the shape was this. The smoke from the stable chimney was a fire, and the fire warmed a man, and the man was named Galen Wilmot, and he was the late Duke's son. Not the Duchess's son. The Duke had got him long ago before his marriage on a woman who had died and had loved the boy in the quiet, helpless way men of that age love the children they could not name, and had meant always to provide for him, and had drawn up the papers that would do it, the acknowledgment, the deed of an annuity. A clean, honest settlement that took nothing from the rightful line, and only kept one decent man from the workhouse. And then the Duke had died before the last of it was lodged, and Vondré had learned of the papers, and Vondré wanted them gone, because Galen Wilmot acknowledged was a charge on the estate, a small one, a few £100 a year, but a charge with a name and a claim to honest treatment. And Galen Wilmot unacknowledged, denounced, transported for some invented theft or pressed aboard a ship by men paid not to ask, was simply gone. And the few £100 stayed in Vendré's pocket when the estate fell to him, and no awkward half-brother stood in any room to be looked at. The papers were the man's whole protection. The papers were in the strong box in the disused tack room. The key to the tack room, and to the loft above it where Galen slept, while Vendry's men asked after him in every town within 40 miles, was the small black key the Duchess kept in her glove and slept with looped round her wrist, because she had promised her husband on his last clear morning that she would keep his son safe. And she was a woman who kept her word, though the house came down. Briony sat down on the cold floor, beside the old woman's chair, and held the bare hand with the key in it, and did not let go for a long time, and that was the night the thing changed from a house she worked in to a house she belonged to, though no one had given her leave to. Esterly knew. She understood that within the week he came and went from Cravenhurst on the business of the will, grave and contained, a tall man of 36, with the kind of face the cold seemed to suit, dark hair gone iron at the temples, a jaw that did not move much, eyes the grey of slate before rain. He spoke little and decided much, and the servants were a degree quieter when he was in the house, and Briony had taken him at first for one of the cold ones, the lords who counted a music mistress with the candlesticks. Then she saw him cross the kitchen garden at dusk, with the basket. Mrs. Sauthey. Dunwell was too watched to carry that night, and saw him pass it through the stable door with his own gloved hands and stand a moment in the dark, talking low to whoever took it, and she understood that the coldness was a door he kept shut on purpose, and that behind it the man was doing the most dangerous thing a man of his rank could do, which was to risk everything for someone the law said did not matter. She did not tell him she had seen. He told her, in his own time, in his own few words, in the library, 3 days later, with the rain coming down the long windows. He said that the Duchess had told him she had taken Briony into her confidence. He said it without warmth, watching her, and she understood that he was deciding whether the old woman had made a mistake, whether the young woman was a danger or a help, whether the 3 months had bought any trust at all. She did not protest her loyalty. She had learned that the people who protest loudest are the ones being paid by the other side. She only said that she had carried the basket twice already, when Mrs. Tatchy. Dunwell was ill, and told him what the carrying had been. How she had gone across the frozen kitchen garden in the last grey light, with the covered basket heavy on her arm, past the dry fountain and the chained great doors, to the small low door at the stable's end that opened a hand's breadth when she scratched the agreed 3 times on the wood. How a voice came out of the dark behind it, low and careful and educated, a gentleman's voice worn thin with cold and waiting, and thanked her and asked after the Duchess, always after the Duchess first, whether the old lady was keeping warm, whether her cough was better. How once she had heard him through the door humming, very softly, to keep himself company in the dark, an air she knew one of the Duke's own, and had understood that the dead father and the hidden son had shared a love of the same slow tune across all the years they were forbidden to share anything else. The man inside thanked her in a whisper, and never once asked her name. She said, though she had given him hers freely, and he would not take it, saying gently through the wood that what she did not know of him, and he did not know of her, was the safest thing either of them owned. And she thought a man who would not take the name of the woman feeding him, for fear the knowing of it would put her in danger, was a man worth the trouble of saving. Something moved in his face then. It was not a smile. It was the small failure of a discipline that had been holding a long time, a tightness around the eyes that loosened for the length of a breath, and then he turned to the window so she could not see the rest of it, and said that she should not carry the basket again, that it was his risk to carry, and that he would not have her ruined for a kindness. And she heard under the cold, flat words the thing the words were built to hide, which was that he had already begun to be afraid for her, specifically, and that this frightened him more than Vendré did. If anyone is still with me in this quiet house, listen, because the trap was already laid, and none of them yet saw the shape of it. Vondre moved in November. He did not move loudly. He moved the way water moves into a cellar, by every low place at once. He produced, through the firm of Lambourne and Mattern, a paper of his own. And the paper was a deed of acknowledgment in the late Duke's own hand, witnessed and dated and sealed, declaring Galen Wilmot to be no son of his at all but a servant's child, foisted on a grieving family, and worse, naming the man a thief who had taken plate from Cravenhurst and fled, with a sum set against his name and a magistrate's warrant got out for his arrest. It was beautifully done. The hand was the Duke's hand, or so close that the difference would hang a man rather than save him. The seal was the Duke's seal, and it turned everything the Duchess held in her strongbox into the opposite of protection, because now the honest papers, if produced, would look like the forgery, and the forgery already lodged with the court looked like the truth. Esterly brought the news to the Duchess in the long gallery, and Briony was at the harpsichord at the far end, and she stopped playing, and no one told her to start again. The old woman read the copy Esterly had got, and her gloved hand closed so hard on the head of her cane that the kidskin split across the knuckles, and she said, in a voice gone, suddenly very old, that she had thought Vendre would try to take the man, and had not thought he would think to take the truth first. The dismissive word came again that afternoon, in the worst possible mouth. Vendre himself called all tenderness to condole with his dear cousin on the painful discovery that a creature she had sheltered was a common thief, and Lady Galindra came with him, and when she saw Briony rise from the instrument and gather the music to leave them privacy, she said, lightly to no one and to everyone, "Daz," that it was a wonder the Duchess kept a music-girl at all in such times, when every shilling would soon be wanted, and that hired playing was a luxury a ruined house could not afford. She said music-girl the way one says a smudge on a glove. The Duchess heard it. Esterly heard it. And Briony, who had heard worse and survived it, kept her face still and her step even, and went out, and only her hands, when she set the music down in the next room, were not quite steady. She had heard something else in that gallery, though, that no one else had marked, and it would not let her sleep. She had copied music for a circulating library for 2 years. She knew hands the way a shepherd knows sheep. The loop, and the lift, and the little private habits a pen falls into when no one is watching. And the Duke had been her patron in a small way before he died, had sent down sheets in his own hand for her to fair copy marginalia, a list of airs he liked, a note or two of thanks. She knew the Duke's hand. And the forged deed, the copy of which Esterly had left on the gallery table, was the Duke's hand in every particular but one. The Duke had formed his lowercase letter D with a little backward curl at the top of the ascender. Every time a small left-leaning hook, he could not have suppressed if he tried, the unconscious signature inside the signature. The forger had got everything else. He had not got the D. Every D in the deed stood upright and honest and wrong. She did not run to anyone with it. She had learned that a woman who comes running with a marvel is a woman easily disbelieved, and that the truth, to be believed, must be made undeniable before it is spoken. So she went, the next morning, to the muniment room, where the Duke's old papers were kept. It was a narrow, cold chamber off the steward's passage, lined floor to ceiling with deed boxes and bundles tied in faded tape, smelling of dust and tallow and the particular dry sweetness of old paper, and Mrs. Dunwell, who had begun to trust her, let her in with the second-best key, and stood guard at the door with her arms folded, asking no question, which was the housekeeper's largest gift. Briony lit 2 candles and spread the dead man's hand before her. Letter after letter, account after account. A column of figures for the hay harvest of a year long gone, a kind note to a tenant whose cow had died, a list of heirs the Duke had wished copied with 3 of them scored through, and a small impatient blot beside the 4th. She worked through the short November day until the light failed in the one high window, and she had to draw the candles closer, and her fingers went stiff with the cold and the care, and still she did not stop, because each sheet she turned added one more honest backward hook to her count, and not one exception rose up to undo her. Until she had 30 true examples of that little leftward curl at the head of the D, and not a single D that stood upright in 30 years of the man's life. She copied each one out herself on a single clean sheet, in her fairest copying hand, numbering them, dating them from the letters they came from, and set beside them a careful tracing of the forger's upright D, lifted from the deed, so that a child, or a magistrate, or a jury, gauging, could lay the one against the other and see in an instant that the two were made by two different men. She did not yet know whose hand the forgery truly was. She knew only that it was not the Duke's, and that she could prove it. And that proof, in the right room at the right moment, would turn Vendré's whole edifice to sand. What she did not know was that Vendré had a watcher in the house. It was the under-footman, a sullen new man called Galsy, whom Mrs. Manet Dunwell had never liked, and he had seen Briony go 3 days running to the muniment room, and he carried it to Vendré, and Vendré understood at once that the music girl was dangerous, and Vendré, who never raised his voice, set about getting her out of the house before she could open her mouth. He did it cleverly. He let it be known, through Lady Galindra, who repeated it as concern, that the music mistress had been seen carrying food across the gardens at dusk, to the very stable where the thief was rumored to hide, and that one wondered whether the creature was not in the man's confidence, perhaps his accomplice, perhaps worse. It was the second voicing of the label, and it was public now, dropped at the squire's table at Hollowmere where it would travel, and it was no longer music girl but accomplice, and the difference was a prison. Esterly came to her that night in the music room, and his face was the color of the ash in the grate. He told her what was being said. He told her she must go quietly before the magistrate's curiosity turned her way, that he would settle a sum on her, and find her a respectable place far off where Vendré's reach did not run, and that she must let him do this, because if she stayed she would be ruined and possibly worse, and he could not, he said, and then stopped, and could not finish the sentence, and started again, colder than before, and said only that he could not allow it. She refused. She did not refuse, loudly. She set down the candle and she told him, in the plain, honest voice she kept for the moments her values were in the room, that she had found the thing that would save Galen Wilmot and break Vendré both, and that she would not carry it away in her box and leave an innocent man to hang for the comfort of her own safety, and that he might find her a place in Northumberland or the Moon, but she would not go until the deed was proven false in front of the men who believed it true. And she told him about the D. He went very still. He made her show him, there by candlelight, the clean sheet with the 30 true hooks and the one false upright letter. And he looked at it for a long time, and when he looked up, his discipline had failed altogether, and what was in his face was not cold at all. It was something close to wonder and close to fear, and very close to one other thing he did not yet permit himself to name. He said her name, not Miss Galmoy. He said, Briony Lowe, the once, and the word fell into the silence the candle had made, and they both heard that he had crossed a line he had been holding for weeks, and neither of them stepped back from it. He said the proof was good, but not enough. He said a sheet of letters in a music mistress's hand would be called a forgery itself, the moment she produced it, that Vendré would say the girl had made it to shield her accomplice, and that the D, however true, would die in the saying. They needed the forgery's true maker. They needed to put the upright D in the hand that had drawn it, in a room full of witnesses who could not afterward unsee it. And for that they had to know who Vendré had hired, and they had 4 days, because the magistrate's men were coming to search the stables on the Feast of St. Catherine, and when they searched they would find Galen Wilmot, and the warrant would do the rest. The black moment came on the 3rd of those 4 days, and it came as such things do, dressed as the end of everything. Galsy the footman, who had carried tales out, now carried one in. He went to the magistrate himself, not to Vendré, because Vendré had been careless and had not paid him quite enough, and he told the magistrate that the Dowager Duchess of Cravenhurst was knowingly harboring the wanted thief Galen Wilmot, in her own stables, and that the proof of it was a key she carried always on her person, the key to the very place. And the magistrate, a decent dull man named Luttrell, who did not want to do it and saw no honest way around it, came to Cravenhurst Hall on the morning of St. Catherine's Eve, with 2 constables and a paper, and asked the Dowager Duchess of Cravenhurst to give up the key she wore in her glove. Briony was in the gallery. She saw it all. She saw the old woman stand in her own hall with the lawyers and the magistrate and Vendré, who had come to watch, ranged before her, and she saw Vendré's soft white hands folded in front of him in patience, certain now, the trap shut. She saw the magistrate, ashamed, hold out his own hand, and she saw the Duchess of Cravenhurst slowly draw off the left glove, with the dignity of a queen surrendering a sword, and hold out the small black key on its worn ribbon, because the law was the law, and she would not have the old housekeeper or the music girl or the earl charged in her place for an obstruction, and because she had run out. At last, after a long life of running out of nothing, of any other move to make, she gave them the key, and she said, in the silence the only thing left to her, which was that the man in that stable was her husband's son, and an honest soul, and that she had given her word, and that they might break the lock, but they would break it on a lie. And Vendré smiled gently, sorrowfully, the smile of a man whose patience has been vindicated. And the constables went out across the kitchen garden toward the stable with the key, and it seemed that nothing on earth could stop them. Briony stopped them. Not with a cry. She walked out of the gallery and across the frozen garden after the constables, with Esterly a half-step behind her, because he could not have held her back if he tried, and she said to the magistrate clearly, in front of Vendré and the lawyers and the gathering servants and Lady Galindra at the window, that before any lock was broken, she would ask one question of Mr. Lambourne, the attorney, who had drawn and witnessed the deed of denunciation, and the question was whether he had himself seen the late Duke write it. It was a small question. It seemed almost nothing. And Lambourne, who was an honest fool and not a knave, said, of course, that he had not, that the deed had come to him already signed and sealed from Mr. Renda. Vendry, who had received it from the Duke's own desk, and that he had merely entered it. And Briony said then, would the magistrate be so good as to ask Mr. Firsting Vendry to write, here, now, on this paper, 3 lines of the Duke's own words from the deed, that the hands might be compared, since Mr. Vendré had handled the original and could surely recall its form, and Vendré, still smooth, still certain, said that he would not stoop to a music-girl's parlor trick, and the magistrate, who was dull but not a coward, said that in a matter of a man's life he thought the trick worth the stooping, and that Mr. Vendry would oblige him. He could not refuse without becoming what he was. So Vendry took the pen, and under all those eyes, in the cold garden, with the constables waiting, and the stable door not yet open, he wrote the 3 lines, and his hand, which was a clever hand and a practiced one, the hand that had drawn the whole deed by candlelight in his own closet, formed every letter D standing upright and honest and wrong, the same false stroke that stood in the forged deed and stood nowhere in 30 years of the dead Duke's papers, and Briony laid her clean sheet down beside it, the 30 true hooks against the 1 false line. And the thing was done in a silence so complete that the rooks and the bare limes could be heard half a mile off. The magistrate looked from the one paper to the other for a long time. Then he looked at Vendré, and Vendré, who never raised his voice, raised it then, all at once the smooth surface gone, and said that it was a trick, that the girl had copied his hand to frame an honest man, that they would all hang for it, and the more he said, the more the small upright stroke on the paper in front of them all answered him, because he had written it himself. Freely witnessed, and could not now unwrite it. Lady Galindra had come out to the step, and stood there, very white. She understood before the others did. The rival's whole certainty broke in a single instant on her face, and what crossed it was not grief for Vendré, but the cold dawning knowledge that she had backed the wrong horse and praised the wrong man, and called the only person in the county who could see the truth a music girl, and that everyone present had heard her do it. Esterly stepped forward then and did the smallest sufficient thing, and it was enough. He did not strike Vendré. He did not make a speech. He took Brioni's hand, there in the garden, in front of the magistrate and the lawyers and the servants and the woman who had meant to marry him, and he said, his voice low and level and carrying to every ear, that this was the woman he meant to wed, and that any man who named her thief or accomplice named her so to him. A short, plain commitment and a shorter warning, a name claimed in the same ground where that name had been spat as an insult, and then he was silent, and the silence did the rest. Lady Galindra's hand went to her own throat. She had been told her whole life she was the correct choice. She had simply never before been in a room where correctness was not the measure. They did not break the lock. The magistrate, Luttrell, took the 2 papers and the forged deed into his own keeping and rode for the county seat. And within the week the warrant against Galen Wilmot was quashed, and a new warrant was sworn against Vendré for forgery and conspiracy, and Vendré, who never raised his voice, did at the very last raise it once more. But only the walls of a cell heard him. He was not destroyed in the cruel way. He was exposed and undone, and put where the law puts such men. And the great house he had nearly stolen closed its door on him gently the way a house closes on a draught. Galen Wilmot came out of the stable into the daylight for the first time in 2 months. On the morning the warrant was quashed, blinking, thin, a quiet brown man with his father's eyes and none of his father's rank, and the Duchess of Cravenhurst took both his hands in her 2 bare, ungloved ones, and neither of them could speak, and Briony, watching from the kitchen garden gate, with Esterly's coat about her shoulders, thought that this, and not the wedding the county would soon be talking of, was the true marriage the morning had made, the keeping of a long word, the old woman delivered at last, of the weight she had carried in her palm. The honest papers came out of the strong-box into the light. The acknowledgment held. Galen took the annuity his father had meant him to have, the few £100 a year, and the small house at Marwick that Vendré had wanted the Duchess shut up in, and he lived there quietly all his days, and grew roses, and was a good neighbor, and never once troubled the line, only to be let alone, and called by his right name. The Duchess had a son to visit after all. She visited him every week until she died, an old woman in a warm gig, her hands bare in her lap, carrying nothing. Briony married Leander Harknell in the church at Loxhill in the first week of the spring, when the limes were in their first green and the fountains ran again. And it was not a grand wedding, because he found he did not want one, and neither did she. Lady Galindra Corwood did not come. She had gone to Bath that winter, and married, within the year, a baronet of comfortable means and unremarkable hands, and if she thought of the cold garden, and the upright D, and the plain words spoken over a music girl's hand, she never said so, and that was its own correction, and enough. There is a thing he did, after, that Briony kept for herself, and told no one the way the Duchess had kept the key. On the first evening she came to live at Esterly as its mistress. He led her not to the great rooms, but to the music room he had had made ready, a plain, warm room with a good instrument and a window to the west. And on the lid of the pianoforte he had laid, framed, the single clean sheet she had carried out into the garden, the 30 true hooks and the 1 false upright line, the proof in her own hand that had saved a man's life. She had thought it gone into the magistrate's papers forever. He had had it copied for the court and kept the true one for her because, he said, lo, the words coming hard the way they always came to him, he never again wanted her to doubt that he had seen exactly what she was, and seen it before he had any right to, and seen it most clearly in the moment she was being called the least. She did not answer that with words. She sat down at the instrument in the last of the western light, with her husband's hand resting on her shoulder, and she played him the air the Duke had liked best, the one she had been copying the day the lawyers came, the one she had never been allowed to finish in that cold house of grief, and this time she finished it, every phrase of it, in a warm room of her own, while outside the spring came up green over Esterly, and a thread of wood smoke rose, honest and unhidden from a chimney that had nothing left to keep secret. And on the lid of the pianoforte, in its frame, the small false letter and the 30 true ones caught the light and said, to anyone who could read a hand, what the whole long winter had said. That worth is a thing the world is slow to see, that it is seen in the end by the one whose seeing matters, and that a key, once it has done its keeping, may at last be set down, and the hand that held it opened and left, after so long, beautifully empty. If Briony's winter moved you, stay a moment in the warm of it before you go, and remember the old woman in the cold gallery who would not open her hand, and the music girl who could hear a wrong note across a room, and a wrong house too, and would not be silent in it. That is the whole of the story, and it is enough.